Okay, chapter 11, part 6. So we're at the tail end of our subheading, Flawed Humanity, by the way. I think I forgot to mention that. So look in your book. It doesn't restate it in the PowerPoints. Okay, so this is 11.21 Richard Hamilton, just what it is that makes today's home so different, so appealing. So he's really mocking modern culture, consumerism culture. The idea that, the bigger car or the better stuff you have or what have you, the nicer home, that makes you a more important or better person. So there's a shift in this time period. This is 1956, the 50s, which really launches consumerism after World War II, that not by your character or your good acts, your deeds, fate or karma, not by being kind to others or, praying or anything like that, just buying some stuff makes you better. So body shapes become something that can be bought, purchased, as well. So this, I believe, is an image of Charles Atlas cut from a magazine. It doesn't state this in here, but this is the very first pop art collage. And you see a lot of stuff like this as we move through time. But this was the first one in 56. There's a Ford emblem for a car, and this is a Jackson Pollock rug. I don't know much about those actual rugs. I've never seen one, but a tape-to-tape, reel-to-reel recorder. So this was the height of technology, and so was this TV. So that's what we're looking at, not some random object. So he's got this musculature, and it states in the book that this woman would be a fashion model, but it was more likely that she was in a men's magazine where you would look at nude women, and then he's dressed her only slightly with a hat and something to cover her breasts partly. But at any rate, they're idealized bodies to the extreme, not just if we looked at our Greco-Roman ideals, this is quite superhero level. So then we get into surgery and implants and things like that, latest ab machine. And it's just sort of making fun of this and pointing some humor, making a humorous image. So the body is subject of scientific studies, our next segment. So starting in the Renaissance, religious models for human nature held less sway in Europe. The idea that you were going to actually investigate and look into the body was something that was starting to happen. We looked back at Leonardo's drawing of anatomy and a child in the womb, I believe, of someone that died. So that that was kind of unheard of and taboo, but in a different culture here that we have in Iran, in Persia, that was allowed a little bit more at this time, and in the Middle Ages, if you want to say before this time, while Europe was simply praying and fasting and starving, there were some other advances in other areas of the world, and one of them was Persia. And then the mathematical arts were developed, different parts of science, and doctors. The idea of doctors as we know them today began to take place at that time. So here we have an anatomical illustration in Iran, 1680 to 1850, ink and pigment on paper. So we're starting to get into the body and anatomical inquiry. This is later, which it doesn't give us much information, but this is about the musculature on a human corpse. And this is what, if you ever take an anatomy class, I know it's a bit grim, but this is what you're going to see. You're going to go to a morgue or a lab, and you're going to look at a dead body, and parts of it the skin will be removed to show the muscles, and you'll look at this. And this began back in the Renaissance. So there was more interest in this, and we wanted to look for religious and philosophical truths and inner emotions. So there's the drawn back skin, and again, this is likely a woman that probably died in childbirth. So then the doctors wanted to know more about what caused that, so they dissected her. Okay, a little less grim. Muybridge, he is a photographer. He's sort of one of the very early photographers in 1885. He starts to pursue motion, and one of the first things that happens is he photographs a horse running around a track because there's a bet between a couple of gentlemen that horses' hooves leave the ground or don't leave the ground. One person says they leave the ground during running, and another one says no, they never do, which I feel is a little strange because I think you can see that pretty simply. At any rate, he decided to film a horse running, and that was done similar to this, where there's different frames, and he is the father of motion pictures. Movies don't exist at this time. This is 1885. But what he's doing is he's trying to depict motion. So there's like a tripwire. And each time he's moving, it sets it off so that there is a image, a still image of each section of the movement, each phase. So he's watching this guy do a handspring, basically, flipping over, and it goes this way, and then he's starting to flip this way. He also has another camera set up in the front of the guy, so you get that view as well. And it's funny because it says a flying pigeon interfering. So we have this little bird, this was done outdoors apparently, interrupts this photo examination here. So he's looking at all these different segments of the human body in motion. Before this time, there was no way to really draw someone, say, in this posture, or this posture, because he'd be moving too fast. You couldn't draw him quickly enough. So this was an interesting investigation of the human body, 1885. Another segment we get into is the limits of the self, and this is a Maori gentleman from, does it give us a time? I don't think it does. But this is a very typical way to be tattooed or scarified from the Maori culture. I believe this is at least 100 years old. So the idea of scarification and tattoos, which have migrated from New Zealand, that's originally where tattooing came from, in different parts of Polynesia. Polynesia includes Hawaii and Tahiti, and the waterways, the ways that the currents would go in the Pacific Ocean, would allow a lot of these cultures to interact and populate other areas. But also, Captain Cook, in particular, in the Pacific, who was eaten by some Hawaiian tribes. It's a really interesting story. You'll have to look him up. But anyway, he supposedly discovered New Zealand, which was already populated by the Maori. But Captain Cook cruised around in those places, and then he would pick up perhaps a Maori person or a Hawaiian, which they used to call Kanakas. He would pick up people from different areas. Say a sailor died or became ill, they'd hire somebody else from somewhere else, and that's a lot of the way that populations started to move around before, immigration per se happened later on. So different cultures would become sailors. Now, sailors were a sort of country to themselves, if you will. A ship is really isolating. And in a lot of countries, the sailors are limited to a certain area. They're not really allowed to go beyond the port area. And they're considered rather rough individuals that no one else wants to deal with. So sailors are less likely to worry about prejudice, you might say. I'm sure they had some, but they would intermix probably more than a lot of other groups of people because they were outcasts themselves at times. At any rate, we meet this guy, and we can see how fierce he is. I mean, is there a more fierce look to a person's face? I can't imagine a more intense expression. He's really staring you down. And part of this scarification, which is literally carving into the skin, This is much like a leather wallet where you've seen those designs carved in. I mean, that's how deep these lines are. Very intense. But what this is part of the culture. He's completely covered. We don't see his body here. We just see some kind of basket or weaving right here. But his whole body is covered in these tattoos, and what he is, it is defining him. And when we really think about tattoos, we think about them in the current culture, it does attempt to define us. Perhaps there's a bunch of different imagery that we might have, but in a way, it's first of all creating a barrier on the skin that's more visible, and it can promote a sense of standoffishness, not as much as probably in the 21st century, but prior to that, if you had a tattoo, you were saying, please back away from me or stay away from me. It was a little bit more of an antisocial statement. But with this gentleman, it's not so much antisocial as that he is showing his individuality, okay? And it was also a way to frighten his enemies. But in the South Pacific, more specifically, the idea is that your life forces and yourself could change at any time, and this is a way of preserving yourself in a certain moment in time. So he wants to make sure that he doesn't fall apart, if that makes sense. So he wants to make sure that he's one person, he stays the same, and the tattooing protects him in this way. Okay, we get here 19th century. So this is over 100 years old, Maori chief. So I just am reading a book called Bark Skins. It just came out a couple years ago by Annie Proulx. There's an X at the end of her name that isn't pronounced. Anyway, she writes about the Maori. Quite a fierce culture, but they still exist today, and there are movies about Maori culture more and more, and you can learn quite a bit about how they survived over the years in New Zealand. But it's not dissimilar to the Native American story, but it's not exactly the same either, because they're a bit more isolated. But you want to think about the extra eyes or the hot breath. The hot breath. Sorry, I'm gonna go here. Have you seen those images of bulls with the snarling breath coming out? There's somewhat reality to that. So we see it in a cold morning. You see the hot, like breath coming out. So that's another way to depict that. Okay, so we're going to look at something totally different. 1913, we're in the modernism era. So before World War I, this idea of futurism and these different movements all being combined at one time. Cubism is similar, but this one is not Cubism. This is futurism. It's easy to sort of confuse them at times, but very different ideologies here. But this is Umberto Boccioni, and what he's trying to show is that the conventional belief that the skin layer defines the outer edge is not correct, that the body is a mass of wave energy defined by movement through fluid atmospheric medium. So the body is considered less as a human and more as a form that is continuous with others in space. So a little bit of, and that's a bit from the book I just quoted. So that's a bit more of like Einstein's theories, a little bit in there. Everything's kind of moving at one time. There is no, there's no sense of time and space. Everything's kind of moving together. So he's getting into that idea. So a human being is permeable and integrated as part of the total world. Okay? The body's less than human. And again, it's part of continuous space. The muscle and bulk are implied. And we're dealing with sort of aerodynamic turbulence, if you will. It's moving around all those energy fields. So again, futurism, celebrated violence, speed, energy, motion, force. And by the way, the futurists, just a side note, were very pro-Nazi Germany, as opposed to the Surrealists and the Dadaists, which were anti. Different artists took different stances, and we still study futurism because it was an interesting theory before it really got affiliated with the negative aspects of politics and Nazism. But it didn't start out that way, but that is where they went, and there's more on that that you can look up.